Okay, so welcome everyone to this session. We are going to be talking about multiple disadvantage and co-occurring conditions. My name is Anna. I'm Head of Partnerships, Networks and Training at MEAM. And I'm joined by Greg Headley, who's our Partnerships Development Manager at MEAM also. First of all, I'm going to start with an apology, which is never a good sign really, but our Involvement and Inclusion Manager, Ant, is unfortunately unwell, so he was going to be leading the session today. And we've had to pivot in his absence slightly, so some of the content may not be entirely what you're expecting, but we hope it's still really useful in terms of looking at this really important issue. So feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. We're going to try and make this session as interactive as possible. There's going to be some discussion points, so if you are hoping to kind of sit back and just listen, I'm sorry, but we'd really like you to be on your keyboard and putting things in the chat. So just to get you ready for that, if you could put a little introduction in the chat, who you are, where you're from, just to kind of warm up your fingers on the keyboard before we get into the proper discussion. That would be great, thank you. So first of all, we'll start by talking about who MEAM is, who we are, what we do. So the MEAM Coalition, it's formed of several different organisations here. So CLINKS from the criminal justice system, Mind, mental health, Homeless Link, homelessness, and we also have the associate member of Collective Voice, looking at substance use. And these organisations have come together to form a project approach really that's looking at how local areas can improve the experience of those facing multiple disadvantage, so that services and systems are supported by effective coordinated services, people aren't falling through the gaps, and people are empowered to tackle their problems and reach their full potential and contribute to their communities. So that's our overall vision. We're currently working with 32 local partnerships across England. We are in the process, deadline was yesterday, of bringing in 10 new areas to our network as well. So we have quite a reach and a view of lots of different kinds of partnerships. MEAM has been running for a very long time, since 2008. So there's kind of a long history of knowledge built up over the years and evidence of different working practices. So when we're talking about multiple disadvantage, we are really looking at people who are on a least level interacting with lots of different kinds of services. They're facing different issues and they need to get support from different sectors, if you like. So some of the examples that we have on here, we have figure 1 is from the Lankelly Chase Hard Edges report, which is from back in 2011. So it feels like a very long time ago, but it is also still pertinent. And it's just looking at, you know, the different points of interaction for people with different services. But in a more recent report from Lankelly Chase, they noticed that there was a very specific definition of multiple disadvantage that wasn't perhaps taking into account all the experiences. So the more recent report, which is the 4 disadvantage 4D image, is looking at a more gendered experience, and so includes violence as one of experiences of violence as a key form of disadvantage as well. And we kind of find that when we're thinking about multiple disadvantage, it's important to not be too restrictive about categorizing which needs we might be including within that. So that's where we're coming from. So in the way that we work with local areas, we have a framework that's used by local partnerships so that they can start developing a coordinated approach to tackling multiple disadvantage in their local area. What we're really interested in is long-term sustainable change to the way that a local system operates. So we have this framework that's been kind of tried and tested over a number of years that guides local areas through how they want to approach their local issues. And we also now have our system intervention tool as well for when we're really getting more into the details of a system and trying to look at how we can solve some of the problems that people facing multiple disadvantage are facing within the system. So that's MEAM in a nutshell. We also do a lot of policy work, and kind of what's brought us to run this session today, and hot off the press, it was published yesterday, just to make sure that you would all have access to it, and we'll make sure that you kind of get the link to it afterwards. It's on our website. It was a recent report that we've conducted some research among our network areas, looking at co-occurring conditions of multiple disadvantage, and particularly the interrelation between people experiencing multiple health difficulties and substance use who want support, which I'm sure is a topic that everyone's very familiar with, and I'm sure that's why you're all here today to listen to the session. So we're going to be talking through some of the evidence from the report, some of the things that you've experienced, and looking at what we're calling kind of a wicked problem, really, that we know this has been an issue for a really long time, and we know that people have been doing things to try and address the issue, but still people experiencing co-occurring conditions, and particularly those experiencing multiple disadvantage, are still being failed by their system, and what can be done to improve this. So I see Greg has already put the link to the report in the chat, so now you can all access it straight away, but please stay with us rather than going off and reading it, because we're going to go through it. But so today we're going to be looking a little bit at the systems tool that I showed you a quick picture of earlier to guide us through this conversation, and to look at some of the findings from our report. So first of all, we're going to be looking at the problem. So what is it that's happening? What are you experiencing? What are the people you're working with experiencing? Have a think about the potential solutions, and what the options might be, and then also really focusing on acting, and particularly how you as frontline workers can be acting within your local systems. So, and all of this will be guided by the findings from our report, to help give a little bit of that evidence to our conversation as well. So if we get started, and this is where you'll be using the keyboard a little bit more, please, is where we're going to be looking at exploring the problem. So first of all, in your experience, if you could put in the chat, how common are co-occurring conditions, sometimes called dual diagnosis, within the client group of people experiencing multiple disadvantage? What barriers do they, or do you as a professional face? And also whether you've seen any improvements recently. So Greg and I will be keeping an eye on a chat and kind of bringing out anything that's coming up. So straight off the bat, we've got somebody saying it's very common, which makes sense. We'll just see what else can come in. Give you a bit of time to think before you start typing your responses. Greg, I saw some bits in the chat about how there was some difficulty with the chat. Are people able to contribute, or are there some people who aren't?
People can contribute, but I don't think they can see, they can't see each other's comments, which is unfortunate. So just to check everyone, there is an option, the little arrow above. I think it's possibly set differently on this session, because I'm sure some of you know this, but there's a little arrow where you can click hosts and panelists or everyone, just above the chat entry box there. Yeah, but I'm guessing it's not working. So
some people have been able to change it.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well done, Greg.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah. So some people are using it now. So try again, everyone, if you want to. Okay. So there's a comment there, Anna. So those co-occurring conditions struggle hugely to access services, particularly statutory services. That's a theme that comes up regularly, isn't it?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. Very common and very frustrating.
Frustrating, yeah, that can be a good word.
And then impacting most of our young people. So Karen Chetwynd, I'm not sure where you work, Karen, but that's coming up, and it's working now. Yeah, thank you, everyone. Agencies working in silo, lack of dual diagnosis workers slowly. I'm guessing it's slowly changing. That's from David Sutherland. On mine, it doesn't. Oh, right, no.
I think it's interesting. There's one here about professionals often not equipped to work with complex issues, which is quite an interesting one that I think we'll kind of revisit a little bit in a way. But I guess that's more about from your experience as professionals, because you've got what barriers do they or you face, so that's one that's very particular to your experience as a frontline worker.
And then most if not all experience co-occurring conditions, and the barriers of lack of suitable services for people who are chaotic and difficult to engage with. So I think that references people at a more complex support needs end of the spectrum there, which is and it's increasing. Barriers to accessing mental health services, particularly volunteering options, can be limited. Okay.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
A high threshold for or a massive waiting list. A lot of these services require people to be engaged, and often the whole point is these people can't engage, so it is a cycle that carries on. So it's a catch-22 system there. Okay.
I think there's a nice comment here from Amy, which kind of really summarizes the multiple disadvantage experience often, as well as with co-occurring conditions, where there's barriers of waiting times, but also if people are homeless, they're less likely to be picked up by services, or if they have substance use problems, and people aren't getting the assessments and the support they need, which really gets to the heart of the issue of what we're talking about. Often systems and local services just don't feel equipped to work with people who have got several different things going on at once, when actually we know that that's probably a human experience anyway. It's very unlikely that you're going to be like dealing with one thing in a nice contained way. So it is really important that we can start to get this right. Oh no, unfortunately we've got somebody saying that there hasn't been any improvement, or things have got worse. So that's not good.
And then practitioners struggling to navigate services is almost impossible for clients and their families. So I think that's a very, if we can't do it, how on earth can people who'll be support manage it?
There's a number of barriers here listed for the people that you're supporting, because that's something I was going to ask about. We've had quite a lot about the frustrations from the professional side, but what about the experience of the people that you're supporting, and kind of how is this affecting them? So we've had a mention of trauma, judgmental attitudes. All of these things are really important if we think about a lot of the people that we're supporting. They've already been through a lot of very difficult stuff, and we're kind of compounding it as a system.
And then there's an interesting comment from Joanna. So we have a current situation of a client not being able to go to detox because it is considered she has too many mental health needs, but cannot go into counselling because we are told she needs to deal with her substance use first. So this is a classic story. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, so loads of things going on there. Unfortunately, we haven't really heard of any improvements. If you have got an example of an improvement, do pop it in the chat, because it's always nice to have a more positive angle coming in as well at this initial stage. But sometimes that's just not an option, is it? So yes, it sounds like everyone is really aware of this problem. You have lots of examples from your own work to back this up, which takes us quite nicely to the findings from our report, which I certainly found, like when I was working frontline, it was often quite validating to see a report that basically summed up everything that I felt I was experiencing. So one of the first things for us to mention is that actually there's a real absence of a unified national data set on firstly the delivery of mental health services, but also there's limited data sharing between mental health and substance use services. So actually we really struggle to find out the prevalence of co-occurring conditions, even though, as you've identified as frontline workers, you're seeing it all the time, so we know it's a big issue, but we don't actually have really robust evidence to back it up. So through the examination in our report, we were looking for other ways of finding this evidence. So PHE says that 77% of people in drug treatment and 86% of those in alcohol treatment will also be experiencing a mental health issue. When we're talking about rough sleeping, 82% have mental health problems, 60% have drug and alcohol problems. So when we're starting to look into the figures, it is quite clear that the multiple disadvantage cohort does have a high incidence of co-occurring conditions. Again, that's something that we all know, but we need to look into the data a little bit more to be backing this up, so we can start to be thinking about it. So within the report as well, some of the things that you might be quite familiar of and some of the things that you were mentioning there, and as we go through these in the chat, feel free to kind of come in with any experiences that you've had that relate to this. But within our report, we've kind of been able to drill it down to some kind of key themes. So one of the major ones, and again, this was coming out in the chat quite a lot, was refusal or withdrawal of treatment for a variety of different reasons. So for some people, they're being discharged after they're missing an appointment or attending intoxicated. Again, you'll be very familiar with that, or there might be antisocial behaviour. And again, we know that these are things that are likely to be happening anyway if somebody's experiencing multiple disadvantage or has co-occurring conditions. There were some quite interesting results of referrals being refused when the individual being referred was kind of already known to services and was just automatically considered unsuitable. So that ties in quite well to some of the attitude issues that we were talking about in the chat there. But really, one of the biggest reasons was co-occurring conditions in itself. And we heard that early, you know, mental health requiring that somebody be fully abstinent before they were able to access the service, or people having more support with mental health issues. We did find, interestingly, that it was the mental health services that tended to be less flexible in that respect than the substance use services. There was a slight skewing of the data where substance use were kind of more likely to accept somebody for mental health, but still an issue on both sides. And really, again, as we identified in the chat, really that complexity of behaviour in an individual and services feeling that they can't cope with that. So all things that you've identified, we're kind of all being able to draw these together. Accessibility was another key one. So looking at both environments and processes that were leading to more generic offers of support that weren't really considering the kind of experiences that people with co-occurring conditions might be facing, that they might not be able to make appointment times in the same way as the general public, or the locations might not be suitable. And within that as well, you know, not considering the intersectionality of experiences. So there may be some women who've had a significant experience of trauma being asked to attend large substance use services with a high proportion of male clients, and actually that might feel quite threatening and somewhere that they don't feel able to access. And as well as other things such as group work that's not suitable for everyone, long waiting lists, which ties into their staffing resources. Again, all things that I'm sure you're very familiar with. The Kpi culture was something else that came up as well, where if incentives were based around quite narrow criteria, that means that people are less likely to want to be working with co-occurring conditions because they kind of are more complicated, they take longer to work with, and if it's not tying into your KPI, then it feels less urgent. And also that narrowness doesn't really facilitate partnership working either, because when you have quite set narrow KPIs, you're kind of more focused on what you need to achieve rather than necessarily being able to partner with somebody else and work in that way. Funding and staffing levels, that will be no surprise to anyone. The number of cuts that we don't need to dwell on at the moment, but it means that a lot of services are operating at minimum capacity and really driving them to focus on core business. And another element was kind of the lack of a clear pathway when somebody's experiencing complexity. And as we know, people falling between gaps. So they're not eligible for primary mental health care, but then they also don't meet the thresholds for secondary mental health care, and just leaving people without any support whatsoever. And finally, we touched on this earlier, kind of the poor partnership working. You know, there can be great differences in how people are approaching care. So mental health might be a more clinical, medicalized version. Substance use might have a more therapeutic approach, and then that can cause difficulties in working together. So that was another one. And then trauma, somebody mentioned that in the chat, that's a huge one. Kind of not having that knowledge and consideration of the impact of trauma can massively affect the ability of people with co-occurring conditions to access the services that they need. And that's something we'll revisit more as well. But hopefully we're not all feeling too flat after that long list of problems, which is never a nice thing to hear. Actually, and it's really important that kind of as a frontline worker, you're aware of this. But in 2017, which again feels quite a long time ago now, national guidance from PHE said that it was everybody's job to meet the needs of this client group of co-occurring conditions, from commissioners to providers to frontline staff, and that there should be no wrong door approach, so that every contact can count and help get somebody into the service that they need. And at the same time, NICE guidance are also clear that both mental health and substance use treatment services should support individuals' needs simultaneously, and that mental health should take the lead responsibility for assessment and care planning. Now, I don't know, everyone may be very well up on these developments, but that may be a surprise for some of you. And it takes us back to this issue at the beginning, that, you know, there are these guidelines in place and advice, and it's being talked about, but kind of we're still coming across these issues that you're putting in the chat. I mean, to bring in some more recent positive developments as well, there is additional funding for drug and alcohol treatment over the next 3 years. Dame Carol Black's review kind of kicked off a new 10-year drug strategy, which is aiming to improve some of this collaboration. And the Health and Care Bill has put integrated care systems on a statutory footing with regard to needing to reduce the inequalities between patients, so seeing co-occurring conditions as an equalities issue. So there have been these positive steps, there have been developments, there is guidance out there, as I said, from 2017. So we've had time with it now. But even with kind of all these policies that are announced, we really need to be focusing on the anecdotal, reported and observed evidence. So, you know, first and foremost, the lived experience of the people within this group. At MEAM, we believe that the expert in somebody's life is the person living it. And that is really essential, that we always ask that, you know, what is their experience? What is happening? Often you hear phrases such as somebody is hard to reach or unwilling to engage, whereas actually what that's really covering up is that the person is struggling, or they're frightened, or the services aren't working for them. So we really need to take that into account when we're thinking about this, and seeing the individuals at the heart of it all. Also, we need to listen to what has been seen by professionals. So you guys who are doing the work every day and trying to navigate these systems for the people that you're supporting, it's really important that we bring that evidence in, and that we can kind of be working with it a bit more, because as I said before, it's all very well to have kind of guidelines published, but actually if your experience of doing the work is that it's not happening, it's not changing anything, then we need to be taking that into account. And also kind of listening to what's been seen by other patients, other people within the service, and also taking into account those intersectional elements too, and how they'll be playing out. We know that there's a cost of living crisis. We know that there is systemic racism at play in a lot of services, and so we need to be thinking about that too. So, bearing all of that in mind, and hopefully, you know, we've had a mix, we've had the real challenges that have been identified, but also some of the more structural things that have been put in place to try and change this. We're going to move into thinking a bit more about potential solutions. So, and again, this is for you in the chat. Oh, and I can see that somebody has put something positive in the chat, so I'll definitely be reading that out in just a second. But yeah, considering solutions. So what do you feel could be done in a practical way to create a reality that's in line with the national guidance we've mentioned? Any short-term or long-term changes that we need to see, and also quick wins, because that can be quite motivating too, to be thinking about what could we do that could be put in place quite quickly or quite simply, that could be making a difference here. So if you could have a think about that and pop some of your ideas in the chat. And I'm going to share that James has found something positive in Norfolk. So there's the Pathways Consortium, where agencies work together locally with rough sleepers, so that all the agencies are working together to help people access services, to get people into accommodation, prevent rough sleeping. and housing first as well, and kind of that need for wraparound support and stability. So that's nice. Thank you for sharing positive. Greg, have you got any input from earlier up in the chat that I missed while I was talking?
No, I think we covered most bits. I mean, there were lots of interesting things. We do have 2 questions in the Q&A. Do you want to come to those now, Anna, or should we jump back to them a little bit later?
Interesting.
Yeah, so
I guess I would invite, we've got a question here. I don't know if everyone knows how to access the Q&A. Where statutory services don't view the third sector as professionals and dismiss our input, and what would you suggest as a way forward? And I think we can kind of go into that in terms of our advice when we get to the end Q&A session, but I would also invite people to put in the chat if they've got any kind of that they think would be solutions to that, or things that you've tried.
Yeah. So in the chat, I'm going to jump to, we've also got Doris as co-production is given equal voice to lived experience, lived and learned experience.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then Vicky, we've got have mental health specialists in substance use services and substance use specialists in mental health services. That's that co-location model of like integrated working. Yeah, I think that's a really important.
Yeah, that's a really great
thing to, yeah. And then from Neil, housing versus working here in Worthing. It's good to hear it, Neil. All maintaining tenancies whilst living with multiple disadvantage. It's great to hear.
Fantastic.
Louise, multi-agency meetings and co-location works well and allows partners to discuss joint clients. A one-stop shop for clients can reduce stress and remove barriers to attending lots of different services to access client support. Yeah,
fantastic. And kind of the multi-agency meetings, I know that everyone's diaries is a little bit mad, but that is quite a practical solution if you can kind of try and bring people together. That's not something that's on a much wider scale, such as commissioning. That's kind of just getting people in the right room or on the right Zoom, as it is now, to have that conversation.
And then from Stephanie, so we're a housing association. Oh, it's jumped. We seek grant funding for meaningful occupation worker posts within our supported housing services and bringing mental health support in-house as much as possible. It's a really good example there, Stephanie. Thank you. Yeah. And
again, a different response to missed appointments and gaps in engagement and not just ending support. Yes, that would be fantastic.
So it's a question from James. How do you best suggest professionals navigate services that are not person-centred in how they take referrals from people who struggle to engage? So, any thoughts?
It's a great question. Again, I'm trying not to like just start saying everything in the solutions. But actually, the next question, I feel like lived experience is vital in encountering that question above as well, actually, in letting people kind of advocate for what they need, and not just advocate, but also really explaining what their experience is of a service that isn't person-centered and how that affects them both just in their general well-being, but also in their ability to engage in the longer term. So that's one tack that you can take. Definitely.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's just a note there from Nick to everyone. So please do use the Q&A option at the bottom of the screen if you can, and then I think we can upvote questions as well there. So because we may run out of time. There's a lot of us here today. So yeah, do that.
That's a great comment from Sandra in response to Deborah there by saying, you know, evidence can help a lot. And as I kind of just said, the voice of people experiencing the barriers, but also that cost benefit analysis can be quite helpful too. Because yes, sometimes we are working with people who are concerned about the money side of things. I mean, everyone is in some way, but yes, it can be helpful to have that cost benefit analysis to show, definitely. Any other thoughts around potential solutions, short and long-term changes? You can be as kind of minutely practical or as blue sky ambitious as you like. This is kind of the exploration stage of our systems tool, and looking at it from different angles, really. Are there any quick wins?
And then there's a comment there from Sandra. So joint key performance indicator KPIs and joint commissioning of both substance misuse and mental health services. It's certainly some areas, Sandra, are moving into that now, but it seems like it's a big dramatic step for them rather than something that's completely logical for it all to sit together. But it's interesting.
Yeah, definitely. That better understanding amongst services as to what multiple disadvantages and how to change their approaches to accommodate that, really. I think that's a really crucial one. Again, just that understanding of what life can be like and what is manageable and what might not be manageable, and that will be individual for each person. So yeah, really important one.
Anna, so we have some questions in the chat. Do you want to go to those now in the Q&A? Do you want to go to those now or hold those for later?
I think we'll hold those for later.
Hold those for later, fine.
Because I'm going to move now to looking, unless anyone has any other things they want to quickly pop in the chat. But move now to, sorry, my next slide thing isn't working for me. There we go. So looking at some of the enabling factors that we identified in the report, again, I don't think this is going to be a massive surprise. A lot of these things you've mentioned here. So one of the things that has been found to help a lot is having specialist roles, teams and services. So looking, which is letting specialist services do more focused and holistic work and really build trust with individuals that can make a difference to that accessing services. And it also means that they can be more successful at linking people into mainstream services because they've had that time to build trust. We do have to caveat this a little bit though when we start talking about specialist services within a system, because from our learning at MEAM has been that sometimes specialist services, not only do they have a limited capacity, obviously because it's specialist, but then sometimes people, you know, they're getting more referrals in that they can handle, but it can also act as a disincentive to mainstream services to start changing, because rather than changing how they operate and bringing everybody into their service, they kind of feel, oh great, there's a specialist service, so we just have another branch of the system rather than the original system changing. However, we also acknowledge that change is incremental. You know, system change is not something that can happen overnight, so there is still the need for those specialist services in a lot of areas, but we kind of need to be aware of what effect that might be having on the system overall. Another one that was mentioned was secondments, placements, embedded staff. Great if you can do that. Having those cross-sector staff placements can make a massive difference in not just improving immediate support for the individuals, but also breaking down some of the cultural barriers between organisations or services. And I think we can kind of extend that as well, that it doesn't necessarily have to be an actual funded placement. You know, you can do shadowing as well, which can make a big difference. Or we have some places which are doing a 1 day a week placement between different services, or kind of a more long-term shadowing project, which is having kind of that similar effect to an actual, you know, permanent placement or a secondment. So training and upskilling staff seen as really important, and this can be about supporting you to know when to refer, how to refer, who to refer to, working out the most appropriate support route, because sometimes the issue can be that there'll be kind of a mismatch of understanding between different services of what a service might provide or what their criteria might be. So really getting an in-depth understanding of that can be really important in kind of making the system work a bit better for people. We've mentioned commissioning. This is obviously quite an ideal dream. It might feel less close to what you're doing at the moment, but yes, just that collaboration across sector boundaries. Dame Carol Black's review that we mentioned earlier actually recommends that the Department for Health and Social Care introduces a national commissioning quality standard, which would require local authorities to work with health, housing, criminal justice partners when creating their services, which could go a long way to making things more joined up, as we said. Again, this is something else you mentioned, building in those systems flexibilities. So small flexibilities or tweaks that can help individuals. So as somebody mentioned earlier, not just automatically closing a case if somebody misses an appointment, but being able to kind of engage with that worker to give a little bit more of leeway. Another systems flex that's been really helpful is being able to create direct referral pathways from homelessness or substance use staff to mental health without having to go through a GP, which can kind of slow everything down and make it more difficult, especially if you're kind of working with somebody who may not even be registered with a GP or may struggle to go to the GP. So those direct referral pathways are really important. Also, interestingly, the creation of kind of non-judgmental peer-led social spaces for people. So that's non-therapeutic support, but being able to build up people's confidence as well has been really important. And the single front door approach as well, so that kind of everybody within the system knows how to get people to the support that they need, and they're not going to be turned away and asked to fill in another referral somewhere else, but actually you can kind of direct them as needed. And COVID-19, I'm not saying that that's an enabling factor that you should seek to replicate in your local area, but that it is important to acknowledge that in many areas it has been an enabler for improving the support of people with co-occurring conditions. There was a real need, especially with the Everyone In initiative, for better cooperation between substance use and mental health services. And although it maybe didn't reach the exact standard that we would have liked it to, there was differences in working, there was more cooperation in many areas. And I think this is important for us to acknowledge and try to preserve some of that, as maybe some services start to try and go back to kind of business as usual, but also it shows us that it is possible for adaptations to be made. You know, when there was a crisis where that needed to happen, in many areas it did happen. So it gives us, I guess it gives us that little bit of hope, but also that view of what's possible for us to remember. So I've mentioned a lot of things there that might feel perhaps for some of you a bit removed from your position as a frontline worker. Sorry, my slides are not moving. There we go. So we're going to go into a discussion now, which I think is a really important one for us within this conference. And it's about acting in the system, but within your frontline roles. So a really important question is, what methods have you used to be dodging the kind of all of those restrictions and difficulties that we mentioned? What clever workarounds have you found in your area, or what's made a real difference? When we're thinking about the enablers, which of those could you contribute to and how? And I'd encourage you to be quite creative when you're thinking about that. And then maybe just a little bit of a reflection about what is your personal agency within the system as a frontline worker. So again, answers in the chat, and it'd be good to spend a little bit of time getting quite into these questions as well. And I think this will relate probably, I imagine, some of the questions that are coming up in the Q&A. So yes, have a think, and then have a type and share your thoughts with us.
Just while people are writing things down there, I just want to reflect on Amy's comment there, which is related to really flexibility. So flexibility on clients being under the influence when having mental health assessments. I think this is people who are constantly under the influence, thereby excluded from any kind of mental health assessment. I think it's a really valid point related to the last slide there.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I think we can start to consider that within here as well. You know, how do you start to get that understanding as well? So Lucy has been seeking advice in advance and then being able to quote that when working with the local authority, which can really be really helpful to intercept kind of attempts to dodge regulations. I think that's a really important one. I think as a frontline worker, yeah, really equipping yourself with the knowledge of what should be happening and being able to kind of quote that and push that back is really important. And I know that can be difficult because you're busy and you're working with individuals where there's lots of things going on, and sometimes it can feel difficult to kind of maybe take the time to read up on something and kind of pull out the bits that you need. But I think it is really well worth doing.
So, Louise, in Essex, there's been job shadowing between mental health and third sector services to increase understanding of each other's roles and how we can improve joint working. Myth busting has been important. And I'm guessing, Louise, as well, just building better personal relationships with those workers across the sector means you can pick up the phone when you need to and call in favours as well.
That's really interesting, because I think as well, sometimes with the placements that we mentioned as an enabler or the job shadowing, sometimes that might feel like a formal arrangement that has to be created and signed off by everybody, but actually there's probably some leeway with some shadowing to kind of just be setting that up. If you have a contact, you could just say, hey, could I maybe spend the day with you to understand that you better? Yeah. That's something that's quite easy to set up in a lot of places.
So it's a similar reference here from James. So one of the ways of enabling and navigating services is to network with SPOC, so specific points of contact in agencies, but this relies on consistent staff who are networking and building up contacts. So it can be challenging with such I think we've experienced some big staff turnover in the sector. And I know there's been a bereavement of loss of good contacts for many people, but yeah, it's good point there, James.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. It relies on consistent staff or just very persistent looking for contacts all the time as people move on. One of my favorite things was, you know, when you email your regular contact and you get that out of office, quickly noting down who the out of office is redirected to and then following up with that person. Trying to keep that link.
There's a tool here, I think, it's from Joanna SHP. So we'll share that afterwards as well. I haven't come across that, Joan, the team around me. So we'll have a look at that. And then holding people to account through safeguarding, quoting back legislation, NICE guidelines, local dual diagnosis policy. Absolutely. Very much so, May.
Absolutely, really good that you're doing that.
Impact of addiction on individuals, flexibility of when and where services are prepared to see individuals is crucial. No point in arranging to see someone at 11 a.m. when they start drinking at 8 a.m.
Absolutely.
Definitely, David. So yeah.
And I guess how do you get that to happen? Is that through building up that relationship with the person who's working with them or the overall team and trying to kind of go in and yeah, maybe even just giving them a rundown. I used to find that kind of almost doing like a day in the life of somebody that you work with and being able to communicate that to other services could be quite helpful. You can kind of see the light switch flip, the kind of thing, oh, everything I'm doing is not going to work. So yeah, that can be very important.
And then from Lucas, understanding trauma, building connected relationships with statutory and other third sector and health organisations, learning, adapting, thinking outside the box, piloting new approaches, using technology and digital platforms to communicate. I think that latter one is very interesting. How we connect digitally. I know there's Homeless Link have been running it's not called that anymore. The Slack channel for people with no recourse to public funds, where people are sharing resources and ideas and solutions there, and it's been very positive as an example.
We've got, you know, advocacy between services, but also making sure the individual voice is kept central. Yeah, that's a really important one. At MEAM, we've really found that co-production is just fundamental to getting some of these changes in place, and being able to bring in that voice of lived experience can really help ground things, but also bring out solutions that, you know, people who've been working or running services for a really long time just haven't considered as well. So that's really important.
Basingstoke Social Inclusion Partnership, which is a multi-agency partnership. It's led to joint training, joint working protocols, local authority commissioning. Consistency of approach is key, as well as commitment from partners. So doing training alongside peers in the sector can be a really valuable experience for building up better relationships. Yeah, for sure.
Definitely. And also, if, you know, it's something you're trying to suggest, you can take the financial angle too, that it, you know, it can halve the cost of the training if you're doing it jointly with a partner. So I guess trying to think about all the different angles to argue for these things can be really important.
Neil is finding the SPOC at his local DWP office is a good source of information. Louise, we're one of the 15 pilot areas for delivering Changing Futures initiative from governments to look at systems change and incorporating lived experience at all levels and challenging commissioning down to frontline workers on how they work together and with clients. Certainly partnership working really underpins Changing Futures model. And Louise, I believe you're in Essex. Mark, I think we need to start having a more socio-political narrative within our support, so we can allow a platform for service users to talk about systemic issues, transparency about mental health, complex industry.
That would be fantastic. I think that's a great idea. I think write up that idea and think about how you would implement it, and then get some support from your colleagues and run with it. That would be fantastic.
Vicky, so we have a worker from the local substance misuse service who attends our drop-in once a week. So it's co-location, and a lot of the really great partnership working happens as a result of this off-the-cuff conversations between them and staff, and also provides a comfortable, safe space for clients to engage with substance misuse services. It also means that we can pass on a lot of information without the client having to recount their story in an official referral.
Yeah,
excellent.
Brilliant. Really, really good that that's happening.
Going into services in person if possible, rather than only communicating through emails and calls.
Yeah, it's that well-known phenomenon that if somebody's seen you face to face or had even just the briefest conversation with you, they are more likely to respond to your emails or your calls once they have that connection in person. So that's a good one. And maybe even whether it's making time, I know it can feel difficult when you've got a busy caseload, but do you set time in your diary, or every other week do you try and put in half a day when you go and visit a service or something like that? Just trying to build that engagement into your role as well could be really important.
Implementing open dialogue with support networks led by the service user, 100%. Yeah.
Excellent plug from Nick for the Frontline Network Training Fund.
Yeah, there we go.
If you don't know about that, definitely go and look it up.
Yeah.
Especially if you want to do it for a cross-sector training group, that could be good.
And then Mark's referenced here, and this is something that's certainly come up a lot lately. It's difficult to have consistency when staff are often leaving. So that churn of staff in services, you can invest a lot of time in a relationship with somebody in another service to cultivate that exchange of support and mutuality, and then you can lose it when they leave or when that service is decommissioned. So yeah, it'd be very frustrating.
And one of the things that we talk about within our work at MEAM is, one of the things that we can look at across the system to try and mitigate against that is getting the culture change level right, or the attitude, so that even if you do have somebody new coming in, if they're coming into that same culture of collaboration, partnership working, and that more positive approaches, it can be a bit easier to pick things up if your contact leaves. Obviously that's not a quick win, that culture change, but it is something that can start to happen. The more people who are interested in looking at positive approaches or more interested in doing partnership working, the more you can start to kind of have a ripple effect around on the people around you. So I'm really interested to know if anyone has any thoughts. We've mentioned the enablers earlier, and I might just go back to them. But can anyone think how within your frontline role, ignoring the COVID-19 one, I'd rather you didn't contribute to causing a global pandemic, but how could you contribute within your role to some of these things coming about? And there are ways. So, and we have mentioned some of them already, particularly those building up personal relationships, but there might be some other things too. Yeah, so I just want to give you that opportunity to really think that through.
So Vicky's mentioned sharing skills within staff teams, and I'm wondering as well, just want to ask the group, is anybody here offered informal training across their sector? We have a lot of expertise here in our frontline roles, and just doing lunchtime learnings and inviting other agencies across just to like have a brief informal training. I think that's a really useful thing to think about.
Yeah, definitely. And not many people are going to turn down an offer of training. if you're offering just go in and do it. So I think that's a really important one. Yeah, sharing skills both within your own staff team but also externally.
So from Emma here. So within Lancashire County Council, AST, CMHT, we have developed a domestic abuse and homelessness team that links into the third sector, as well as Changing Futures to help make mental health services assess social care less fortified. Access, sorry, yeah. Mental health services access less fortified. Yeah, I think it's it can appear like a fortress. It's a very good word. Emma, mental health services. So I think it's a good thing to think about.
Any other thoughts in the chat around, how could you contribute to some of these things? I know it's very easy as a frontline worker to sometimes start to feel like, there's nothing I can do, or, commissioning is so far above me, or like we need to get permission to get a particular member of staff in. But actually, what can you do to influence those decisions being made?
So we have from Louise. So in Essex, we've developed trauma-informed training incorporating complex needs and offering to all our partners. This includes the police, mental health, adult social care, etc. We are asking that they understand the adult trauma clients go through due to their multiple disadvantages.
Fantastic.
And Fulfilling Lives South East, the frontline workers delivered training around understanding people experiencing multiple disadvantage to temporary accommodation providers, and the DWP, for example, being the conduit of their clients. So yeah, so Sandra, I know you're involved in the TAG, the Temporary Accommodation Action Group in East Sussex, which has had some really excellent results working with temporary accommodation providers. Yeah.
And you're very quick on the chat, which is brilliant. But yes, that's a fantastic example there of putting that training in. So thank you for sharing that.
So from Neil, my team now has a monthly meeting with our CEO dedicated to our needs and growth of the Housing First service.
That's a really good one. Neil, how did that come about, if you're able to put that in the chat? And yeah, that's great, Samantha. Encouraging internal and external training. Really, really good.
So, I mean, I think what's interesting with Neil's comment there is like looking at systems change and engaging with the people who have the most power and making them your friends, really. Like, yeah, that's a good one.
Oh, great. So you requested one offered monthly. Great. So you got your foot in the door, essentially. And it paid off. So again, I think that's a good example of the importance of asking for things, or maybe, trying your luck in different areas. If there's somebody that you think you need to speak to or could make a big difference, what have you got to lose by asking to meet with them? They could say no, but they may also say yes and offer you a monthly meeting. So it's worth doing.
And coffee and cake and biscuits, big winners in terms of getting things changed in the system. So we have from Vicky, we have a new drug and alcohol commissioner in our borough, so we invited him to come and talk to us specifically around dual diagnosis. He has taken this forward and is trying to bring all the services together and come up with a strategy. So very similar, then you're engaging with the bigwigs
and providing a good lunch.
Yeah,
as you just said, it's all about the food.
Yeah.
But I think some of these examples show us that I think often at the front line you can get quite frustrated. Sometimes it feels like the people who are making the decisions, they don't know what's really going on, or they don't understand what's really going on. And often the people in those positions, they do want to help and they do want to make a difference, and you have the power to help them understand and to help them know what's going on. So if you can kind of start to build that relationship and get your information to them. But this leads us on to, you have to have the information, and a lot of that information is in your head as frontline worker, which is where the discussions come in really helpful. But has anyone developed anything around keeping track of that information a little bit more so that you can share it? And I know definitely when I used to have to type up my notes all the time, I used to find it a nightmare recording my appointments. But actually how essential is that for gathering the evidence that's needed to show that change is needed? You know, we kind of talked about at the beginning how there's actually very little information about the prevalence of co-occurring conditions. You guys are on the ground experiencing what that's like. How can you be kind of recording that or taking that back, even if it's just within your own team? How can you start generating that body of evidence?
So from Amy, so our manager is really good at promoting internal and external training, as well as doing level 2 qualifications. In Exeter, we have good links across the city with services working with homeless people and vulnerably housed individuals, and those services will often invite our team along to any training they're holding. So it's you developed a mutuality there of sharing resources, which is wonderful, Amy.
Fantastic. So just to come back to that last question that we were going to ask was, is it possible to have personal agency within the system? I'm hoping that a lot of you might say yes, but obviously you're welcome to disagree or say kind of how you're feeling about it. But yeah, it'd be interesting to get some of your reflections on that in the chat if you can, around whether you can have that personal agency. You can literally just write yes or no if you're feeling tired of typing. Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Sue. Like, you know, it is possible, but we need to accept that it might be more time consuming, or it might take you away from what you thought would be all of your role. You thought all of your role would be working with the individuals who need support, but actually it's just as beneficial to be putting time in to build those relationships. Yeah, and being realistic about that. I think that's really important, so thank you.
And so from Neil there, yes, I feel trusted to challenge and hold outside agencies to account when needed. It's great, Neil.
That's brilliant. That's what we must all aspire to.
And then from Vicky, yes, if you have the skills and knowledge to back yourself up and to advocate strongly, you can influence change and decisions.
Brilliant. Some really nice, strong answers coming through here.
Yeah. Yeah. And then Sandra, don't apologize, Sandra. Our frontline workers recorded quarterly case studies. As a systems change officer, I was co-located with them so that they could share live experiences to inform systems change. So yes, about teamwork, but about teamwork. Really good point, Sandra.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, it's much harder if you feel that you're kind of doing it all on your own. You need to kind of find the people around you who agree. They don't necessarily have to be in your team. If you can just find that group around you who are trying to do the same thing, that can be really supportive. But yes, Mark, I think you're right. It does depend on the culture within your workplace. But, you know, even just if we think about kind of modeling behavior, it can make a difference if you're trying to kind of focus on a different approach or a different way of working. But as I said, you know, finding other people within your system who agree with that, so that you don't feel alone in doing that, even if you are within a different organization. And this all ties into doing a lot of thinking about systems leadership at the MEAM approach, and like looking at how everyone within the system has agency, and how do you best target that. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that as a frontline worker, you have lots of agency within the system. It may not be the agency that you would like it to be in terms of creating an entirely new service that you know would solve this particular problem, but you might have agency towards achieving that in a different way. So whether that was around building up the evidence or building up relationships in a particular way. So just to move us on to the next bit, around the recommendations from the report. Sorry, Greg.
No, it's just one final comment from Vicky there. So I work for an extremely small organisation, 8 employees, but I feel I have more agency than I did when working in a much larger organisation. Really valid point, Vicky. I think we can, yeah, you're much more closely connected to the senior team in a smaller organisation, and it's much more equitable often. So yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
And then finally from James, the good thing is you can change things for individual cases with the right knowledge and experience and advocacy approach, but it is frustrating when it's much harder to change external systems and how things are managed to affect your systems change. This is after 12 years of working in the same frontline sector and building up SPOCs. Yeah,
it's difficult work. And I think one of, one of the central aspects of the MEAM approach work is that we are looking at those individual cases, but then also examining those individual cases and what was it about using your knowledge or experience advocacy that got the good outcome, and then thinking through how can that be replicated, or what does that identify the key problem within the system. But yes, it is frustrating work, which is why you need to surround yourselves with people who also want to work in a similar way or believe similar things. As I said, even if you just go for a coffee and a moan every now and again, just to build each other up. So just moving through onto the report, obviously you're going to have the link to this, so I'm sure you will want to go away and read it all in full. But some of the recommendations that came out of the report is looking at accountability, so looking at the Joint Combating Drugs Unit, making sure that funding and treatment services available are planned in collaboration with the Department for Health and Social Care and the mental health teams, so that there's a much clearer structure in place, as well as the integrated care partnerships, integrated care board, kind of being able to view co-occurring condition as a health inequality and treating it as such, so that there is a bigger need for integrating with substance use providers. And also recommended that the Department of Health and Social Care should introduce measures to start recording where, when and how often individuals are refused mental health treatment due to existing substance use. So it's kind of dealing with that prevalence issue that we mentioned earlier. And also the Department of Health and Social Care better demonstrating how to implement existing guidelines, so needing best practice and kind of concrete examples for people. Local partnerships, unsurprisingly from the MEAM approach, encouraging local areas to develop local action plans with a wide range of partnerships, so not just kind of mental health or drug use, but also homelessness, criminal justice, anyone else who might be involved, to look at how the support is playing out for people with co-occurring conditions. And within that partnership, an agreement of what the problem looks like and also what good looks like, so you kind of all have a shared idea of what you're aiming for. That's some examples from the partnership. There are more within the approach, and obviously commissioning. So we've mentioned joint commissioning, and also being able to focus on co-occurring conditions and future joint strategic needs assessment, and more flexible and multi-agency service models. And a lot of these recommendations might feel quite high level, but also some of the things that you've talked about today and the solutions that you've identified, taking them forwards on the front line level will make a big difference. If you are kind of, as we said, it does take more time and it can feel frustrating, but it will be making a difference if you're building up those relationships. We've had examples from people within the chat where they are getting better results from it. So yes, absolutely taking it on yourself. And as I said, you will have the link to the report, so you can kind of look through it, and it's got lots more examples of things that people within MEAM approach areas have been doing that you can kind of read about in more detail. But now we've got quite a bit of time, so I think some of the questions are quite knotty. We can move to questions. So if you're able to see the Q&A bit at the bottom, that's where you can post your questions. Some of them are already in there. So
shall I read the first one out, Anna?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, people can chip in the chat if you feel like, oh, actually, I have a good suggestion for this.
Yeah. So if you can't, for whatever reason, access the Q&A box at the bottom, please just pop it in the chat and we'll pick it up as well. So, so it's from Deborah. So what about the people who do not have a care plan, which is the majority of people on support?
Sorry, I thought you were going to come in with an answer there, Greg.
No.
I think a lot of this will be around building up those relationships in the first place to understand so that such services do start to understand that there is this proportion of people where the way things are working currently are not working for them. So a lot of that can come from building up those relationships, bringing in the voice of lived experience to try and support people better in that way. In other cases, it might just be a more kind of informal multidisciplinary team. If you can get together different services, you might be interacting with that person, bring them together to understand a bit more about the case and what's going on. So it might not be a formalized care plan, but you can have a better working relationship with all the important people who are involved. sorry, just looking in the chat. Greg, have you got any thoughts to contribute on that?
No, I think you've covered it really there. But anybody have any thoughts they'd like to add to that? So yeah. Okay. And then so another one from Deborah. So statutory services often do not view the third sector as professionals and often dismiss our input. What would you suggest as a way forward? I know we touched on this earlier, but I think this is a really important thing to dig a bit deeper into. So Anna, I wonder if you have what thoughts you have on that.
This is such a great question. This has been an ongoing issue for such a long time. I think there are a number of different avenues here. I mean, it might feel like I'm starting to sound like a broken record, but building up relationships where you can be really useful. I think going into team meetings, if you can, that might often be your best bet, asking if you can go into the team meeting of a statutory service to give a really clear overview of what you do and what your job involves and the different things that you're doing on a regular basis, almost as, I don't want to say prove yourselves, but almost as a chance to show that actually you're dealing with quite complex things and you have detailed knowledge of how the local system works. So being able to demonstrate that, but also to start to build up those relationships. I think building up evidence as well of some of the cases that you've tried to work with, and the complexity of that can be quite helpful, maybe as a case study, show what you've been doing. And if you can start to get groups where you're, I don't know, working together, and so some areas have communities of practice, some areas have operational groups, there's multidisciplinary team meetings, just situations where you might be coming together and giving your perspective on different cases can start to build up that working relationship and improve that respect between others. So those are some kind of roads in. I think there probably does need to be a more senior directive in some cases around this, because it is an issue. We know it's an issue, and a lot of the solutions can come down to personal relationships, but it would be nice if we could have something else that kind of embeds that respect for the contribution. But we have seen within the report that is happening in some areas. So for example, where people are being allowed, services are being allowed to make a direct referral to a mental health service, that is kind of crediting them with as a professional within the third sector, that they are able to make that judgment. So it is happening, but I think a lot of it is coming from those relationships and making sure you find people who are sympathetic and kind of understand exactly what you do. So yeah, it comes back to that understanding. I've rambled a little bit there, but Greg, if you think I've missed anything there?
Well, there's something I'd like to add really, and I think it's about mirroring how some of those statutory services behave themselves. So it's like, what language are they using? How are they presenting things? How are they sharing information and data? And then reflecting on what we're doing in our third sector service, and are we doing that consistently in a similar manner? So I think there's a certain element where we within the third sector we work more, I'm not going to say we are, of course we are working professionally, but we also maybe work in a freer sense than they do. We're less bound by statutory regulations and remits than they are. But so I think it can make it easier for them to work with us if we mirror, just for their benefit in certain scenarios, how they are communicating and how they're relating to us as well. And then you know, if we're doing that, then they can't pick fault. They can't, like, you can say, well, if they are not taking your word for it or listening, then you can kind of bounce that back at them and say, yeah. So I don't know if that makes sense, Anna, does it?
Yeah, no, it does absolutely make sense. And that's one of the issues that's often identified in that mismatch. Sometimes the language that people use is different, or they might, you know, a mental health service's definition of a crisis is very different to a third sector service's definition of a crisis, and sometimes trying to work out what each mean by that and being able to use it depending on who you're talking to. Really helpful.
So there's some very good arguments for having a glossary of terms and a glossary of definitions that your team, like, at least when you're engaging with statutory services, you use that as your reference point, even if behind closed doors and in your general work, you may act from a slightly different set of motivations, just to move it forward and to develop those relationships further with those statutory services. I think it's a really key element. And I think it's maybe just putting the question to them as well at times. If you've established a relationship of what is it about my judgment that you're finding hard to believe or to take seriously. So yeah.
And Vicky's got another great suggestion in the chat here. We're saying if you take on some of the tasks for clients from statutory services, such as accompanying them to appointments or kind of helping with benefits, giving practical support, it can kind of help them to start to see you as a useful part of their support, and that working in partnership with you actually makes their job easier. So that's a really good point as well.
Yeah,
great.
Definitely. Making yourself invaluable within that system. I mean, whether people in statutory services are busier than us or not is kind of here or there. I'm sure they feel they're busier than us and their caseloads are heavier, and that may well be the case. But in a way, it's taking a humble position and stepping into the breach and supporting them to do their job better will gain some credit, which will allow you to then become more challenging and have a greater inevitably there'll be a greater investment in that relationship and a dependency upon you to some extent as well. But it's a fine line to tread, I think.
So we've got another question here around how can we encourage more mental health services to encourage peer support innovations, where lived experience is an effective way of collectively unpacking our mental health problems and validating people's experience? That's a great question. Absolutely. I kind of feel like Ant would have loved this question and would have had loads of brilliant solutions for this. I think, again, a really good way is bringing in examples of where other areas have done this, or other mental health services, and how it's benefited them and the differences that it's made. One of the things we're trying to do within the MEAM approach network is start building up kind of a bank of examples of good practice around co-production. So having access to something like that, or talking to, if you know of a mental health service that has done this, bringing those examples to your local one is really good. A really powerful one is if you have somebody with lived experience, you kind of is confident and is supported enough to be able to speak to it, having them explain why this would be a really useful and empowering thing to do can be a big good way of encouraging that. So whether asking, maybe you could go with them again to something like a team meeting, which, as you said, is kind of that way in, to kind of talk about it as an idea and get people interested in it. I think those can be some quite useful methods there. Do you want to come in there?
Yeah, it's just one thought really. I think a perception of working with people with lived experience and co-production models is perceived as being very time consuming, and a lot of commitment from services. So I think thinking about how, and yes, it can be for good reason, because it needs to be, but thinking about how you can package it in ways that are bite-sized and accessible, and so ultimately this does come down to gathering good data, generating succinct and on-the-point reports and things like case studies. So it's what materials are you gathering about people's lived experience that's relevant to the point you want to make, and keeping it concise and accessible, really, I think. Yeah, I think again, people in statutory services will feel they're time poor to commit to listening, which is so it's how can you work with them on that to make things more accessible.
Yeah, definitely. And as with everything else, if you've got any other ideas, feel free to pop them in the chat.
So Nick, there's another question from Nick there. So how is the risk assessment of clients conducted when trying to access mental health or substance misuse services? Offenders with certain types of offences are often point blank refused entry to services due to perceived risk to other clients in a group support environment. So yeah.
Yeah, this is a real systems issue that you've identified. That looks like it sounds like that's coming from your local area, because obviously it will be different for different places. So it sounds like you've identified a real issue there. So I don't think we can give you kind of a quick win for that one. But I would say with a situation like this, you probably need to be looking at who your allies might be in wanting to address that problem. So I imagine kind of your probation service, any other criminal justice organisations you're working with, to try and get a clearer idea of how often this is happening, where it is happening, and looking at the parts of the risk assessment that are a problem, and then maybe going and understanding from the mental health service or the substance use services perspective why that risk assessment is being conducted in that way. You know, then there may be really good, clear reasons for them why that's happening. There may not be, but trying to identify which of those it is really important. And then trying to have those relationships in place, to have those conversations to start to really look at this and address it. I mean, it's a difficult issue, because if you're saying that their policy of the risk assessment is the system's barrier in itself, you know, you've got to address that in a quite a delicate way. And if you don't have good relationships in place, it's likely that nothing will change. So if you can start by building up the relationships so that there will be more of a willingness to have those conversations and start to consider the issues, then you're going to get much further than kind of going in with guns blazing. Which is not to say it's not important to challenge, but there has to be some kind of underlying relationship to enable you to challenge in an effective way, I'd say.
Yeah, what Anna said. But I would also, I mean, for me, the classic example comes to mind of people with a history of arson being excluded from housing. And what has worked in some cases is where you can really, where you have the policy, but actually is making it about an individual and looking at the individual cases, and then introducing that question of doubt, which can then lead to a more nuanced adherence to the policy. For instance, it's like somebody who set fire to a bin age 16 in a park is very different to somebody who's burnt down their supported accommodation project last year. And it's sowing that nuance, those conversations around nuance, and how that can then shift into policy and become more person-centered, I think. But it's a big challenge, Mark. Nick.
That's very much what was identified within the report, of kind of systems flexibilities, you know, those one-off situations. And it might feel a bit, oh, well, this is only supporting one person, but actually what you're doing is you're starting, as Greg said, you're starting to kind of sow those seeds of nuance, and the more times you can do that, the more you start to build it up. Yes.
You set a precedent which allows you to build on that later when you need to.
Yeah, and Doris is right, often the issue is down to the insurers.
Of course.
Sometimes you might need to ask, why are you using that insurer? So, but again, we need to have that established base for relationship.
So the comments in the chat, so from James, those are good examples of work being done between statutory safeguarding services, such external training, briefings and strategies provided to the third sector. It would be beneficial if mental health commission services could have longer funding, be able to have better links within with the third sector, like the safeguarding sector have done. Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah.
Completely agree with that. That would be great.
And then Deborah, so we had an agreement before COVID whereby we offered a drop-in within our local CMHT and did brief interventions with people accessing our local CMHT. So that sounds like that's probably quite effective, Deborah, there as well. Deborah, which kind of organisation do you work for, I wonder? maybe if you want to pop that in the chat. And then Lucy, this is a bit of an intense question, but at what point do you make the call to stop offering advice and evidence to a local authority, for example, and take action in the form of a complaint or legal action? I'm wary of burning bridges, but at the same time do not want to let problems roll on. There has to be a limit. I agree. And yeah, Anna, where's the limit?
Gosh, well, I don't want to set the limit and then everyone forevermore goes, well, Anna said in this, in this Frontline Network webinar, and so that's what I'm working on. No, it is a really good question, an important question, and I would take it back down to the experience of the individual that you're supporting. So yes, we want to maintain relationships, but actually if the people that you're working with are suffering as a result of this policy, then yes, you will need to go down a complaint or legal action route, especially if you've given them multiple opportunities to change it and you've shown them why it's important. But if you have the grounds for making a complaint, if you can prove that they're not following a policy as they should and an individual is suffering as a result, for me that would be the line, especially if it's happening again and again and people are kind of experiencing it. So yeah, I would always take it back to the lived experience element.
And I think I mean we're talking about is human rights issues. I think what I would want to think about is not being reactive and being more strategic, and actually where we come up against that systems blockage, think of it as a roadmap of like different stages and plan it in a more strategic way, rather than it being like just you're hitting a brick wall, then this is what you do. Like thinking it through in a more of a roadmap style of way.
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah. And Deborah has come back. She works for the Wallach in the Vale, providing tenancy-related support and people's mental health. So it's great. So it sounds like really good, positive co-location you had going on there, Deborah. And I think you said that was before COVID. I hope that comes back, and yes, we can start to rebuild those bits there.
So I think that's all our questions, unless anyone's with very speedy typing fingers wants to throw one more in. But I think we can kind of draw it to a close there. That's 5 minutes or so before the end. I'm assuming that no one's going to complain if you have a slightly longer screen break than expected. I just want to thank you all for engaging so much in the chat. We felt like it was a little bit of a gamble, and it can be a little bit awkward facilitating when you can't see people, but it's been really great to be able to have discussions with you and hear your experiences. As I said, do check out the report. And we have lots of MEAM approach resources on our website, so you can access those for free, and just keep doing what you're doing and try and take some of the suggestions from today and start to implement them in your everyday work, because you are really important parts of the system, and you can make a difference even though it is a very difficult issue. So thank you very much, everybody. Enjoy your 5 minutes. You've earned it. And take care. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. It's been a real pleasure. So stay in touch. We're here. Bye. Bye.